Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Randy Johnson. Welcome to Next Wave CNC Q&A for this evening. Got a good group tonight. Just a couple of quick things as we get started. If you've not used Zoom before, you'll find somewhere in a control panel at the bottom or the top of your viewport there, and there's a Q&A button. If you click on that during the meeting tonight and you want to enter some additional questions, please feel free to do that. The staff here will be monitoring those and will be responding to some of those as we answer some other questions that came in during the registration. Again, my name is Randy Johnson. I am a CNC trainer and tester with NextWave. Also, we have online tonight Scott Latham, and Scott is with the tech support team down at NextWave, and he pretty much covers all areas. So he'll be handling quite a few questions tonight. We also have Brendan and Mitchell online. Brendan and Mitchell are computer programming specialists, and they do the work behind dependent software and firmware, as well as the special apps such as Ready to Control and Ready to Raster. So they're your go-to people for answers on if you have questions about the software and the firmware. So we're going to kind of do a round robin tonight. I'll start out with a few questions that came in when everybody registered, and then we'll pass the mic around to the other guys. But also, as I said, if you have questions during it, feel free to weigh in on that. Otherwise, we're going to go down the list. We got about 60 questions that came in. So it's quite a few questions. We'll be spending a few minutes or more on each one. We'll see how it goes. And of course, after the webinar tonight, if any of your questions don't get answered or you have a pressing need relative to something mechanical or electrical on your machine, you can, of course, call contact Scott's department, the tech support department, and email them, and they'll be glad to help you out with that. Some of the questions that came in are pretty big. We won't have time to go into detail on some of them, but we'll give you some resources along the way to help you further your education and other places where you can look. NextWave has several resources available at their website, and there's some other places we can point you to as well. So with that, let me bring up my list here and look at a couple items. Got a good question here that came in. I thought it's a good one to start with. And the question was, what I wish I did when I started out in CNC. And I've been doing CNC work. I actually got into industrial CNC back in the 90s when I helped with the cabinet business. But since then, I've spent a lot of time in the small shop area of CNC. So I've been doing CNC with the smaller machines for about 15 years now. And so as far as a list of things that I wish I had done differently when I got going, actually probably have about 5 things, but one of them was I wish I'd bought a spindle right off the bat. I am so happy that I have a spindle now, and many of you who have it probably are experiencing the same thing. Number one reason is the quietness of it compared to a router. And secondly, the newer spindles now, you've got automatic speed control, which is just really nice. You can program the speed control in VCarve, and it transfers right over to the spindle. So if any of you are still in the market for spindle, you should check that out because it's a great upgrade. The second item I wish I'd done when I started out was put spoil boards on my small machines much sooner, because I find the spoil board to be such a convenient element for setting it up. And we'll be talking about spoil boards a little later on as well, but that's one item I certainly wish I had done. I also wish I learned more about the controls of the machine, like the homing routine, which most machines have now for setting up jigs and zeroing out the machine. And we're going to be talking about homing tonight as well, which is interesting because some of the things that I see as key are actually some of the questions that came in today as well. The other thing that I do a lot of now, and I recommend people do that I also wish I'd done earlier on, is log my results. Take a couple pictures, save my files, make sure to make a note in my file with the feeds and speeds and the router bit and all that was working out well. And keep track of that, because the sooner you do that, the sooner you get an idea of how your machine runs, what kind of materials you can cut with what kind of bits and what kind of feeds and speeds. And we'll be touching a little bit more on that as well tonight. And then maybe the one other thing is, although they weren't available, I wish I'd taken a class or a seminar when I first got started. I mean, when I started out with CNC, this is about 15 years ago now, I was working for American Woodworker magazine. I started writing articles on it. And no kidding, I went out to look for CNC projects on the web, and I barely got a page of Google searches. Of course, now you get millions of hits probably, but that's how fresh CNC was back then. There was just very little out there. So I attended what webinars there were and seminars, especially through Vectric, but there's lots of other things available. I do some stuff myself. NextWave does some things. So that's something else I wish I'd done when I got started. And on that note, what I'm going to do here is bring up a couple of questions that came in relative to webinars related to that getting started question. Mark had asked, what's your recommendation for getting started? And if you haven't discovered or taken the Getting Started webinars, the free webinars with NextWave, I'd highly recommend that. In fact, let me bring up the website and show you where you can find that information. So if you go out to the main website, go to the support tab, you're going to find a lot of resources there, and we'll be talking about some of those tonight. But in particular, there's a webinar and training site out there. And this shows the upcoming classes and webinars. I'm currently doing an active class on VCarve and Toolpath Essentials. If you still want to get into that, you still can, because we mail out all the videos and all the handouts if you missed the first couple sessions. And I have some people adding that class late, so you can certainly still add that and get all the information. Of course, we've got our Q&A webinar going tonight. We've got an online class on Rotary coming up, as well as one on laser. I know there were some questions about that tonight, and certainly point you towards those classes for complete information on those. Got one on spoil board, but way down the bottom here, 3 primary getting started webinars that have been pre-recorded. We were holding those about every month, but now we put them up for viewability right off the website. So getting started covers getting started with the basic machine and then pendant. There's been some updates to the pendant recently that are worth checking out, that one. And then the third one is on ready to control. So those 3 will really help you get off to a quick start with the machine. And then actually within ready to control, there's a couple of projects ready to cut right there. And you can also go to the NextWave website. Under projects up here, there's some projects to cut. And Vectric also has quite a few free projects on their website to cut that you can cut and get started with as well. We will be adding some more webinars as we go along. Like I said, we've added these 3 classes, and right now we'll also be doing some more webinars. We've got some planned for some of the other accessories. No dates have been announced on those yet, but they'll be forthcoming, and you'll probably see those in your email or the newsletter when they come out. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Scott here. Scott's got a couple of questions that he has on his list that he'd like to cover.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. So a lot of the questions that I got on the list that got assigned for me have to do a lot to do with the laser and getting started with it. To start with that, there's 2 different ways of actually using the lasers, not just the 2 different lasers that we have. In the VCarve software, Vectric did release their laser module that has a laser cut and fill and a laser picture. We're still currently working with Vectric to make the laser picture toolpath side of that work better. Unfortunately, I don't have a date of when that will be released again, but I know we are currently working with them to get that taken care of. In the meantime, we do still have the Ready to Raster program to do all the laser picture engraving that you would need. And I'll cover that a little bit in a moment as well. But back to the 2 different methods. We have the laser module, which is a paid for add-on in their software. But we also have how we were originally doing it using the quick engrave toolpath and setting up the laser as for example, an end mill as the basis of the settings. Using that, you're able to do all of your vector line engravings, things like that. Picture engraving to do after doing a bitmap trace. So if you happen to take a look at Randy's webinar for getting started, he uses that bitmap trace to outline the light bulb. The laser could be using the quicker engrave to do that. Alternatively, using the laser module that Vectric had come out with, that is when you were able to start using the laser cutter in their tool database. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There are 2 different ways in the VCarve software to use the laser when it comes to laser engraving. On our Help Center page, we do have the basic parameters or the starting points for pass depth, line thickness, things like that. For doing the laser in those two options, as I said, we have that available on our Help Center. Some of the other things that go on there are a lot of where do I start with that? A lot of it has been trial and error, playing around with the feed rates along with the power values. One of the other articles that I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat if I get it here in a moment. We've also created on our Help Center a laser feeds and power grid test. It's a small file, and there's tap files in this article for both the 7 and 2 watt laser accessories that will run on any machine that has the LCD pendant. So the all of our current SD series, the HD 4 and 5 series, and this will also work with the SD 100 machine as well. But it creates a small grid pattern with both a fill and just an outline at various different feed rates and power values to try and give you a better head start on getting started with the laser itself. So with this, you'd be able to take this grid pattern, take it or put it on a piece of scrap material, whichever you're looking to actually do an engraving on, run it to see what's going to give you the best feed rate and power value for that. One of the other things you'll see, especially with the fill sections, is how the grain of the wood will end up affecting how that burn ends up happening as well. If any of us here have used the laser, you've kind of seen lighter parts of it reflect a lot more light and take a little bit longer to burn, where darker parts absorb a lot more of that and are easier to burn and can burn at a faster feed rate. When it comes to laser picture engraving, the Ready to Raster software is currently the best option. It's very fast and efficient. One of the things that it does to keep mindful of it is if there is white area, at the top or bottom, the laser will be running that entire time in those areas, but will not be firing. So it just takes a little bit of time to get down out of those white areas and then actually down to the picture itself. When it comes to the Ready to Raster program, it's very straightforward in importing your picture into the program itself, letting the software know what machine and laser it is. When it comes to the 7 watt laser, there's a few more points to take a look at, such as power value and feed rate as well. Some of that takes a little bit more playing around because each picture is different and the grayscale is going to turn out a little bit different for each time as well. So that one does have a little bit more of a learning curve for it. But once that setting is in there, the Ready to Raster will give you a file that is directly ready to be put on the machine itself. It's not something that has to be put back into VCarve and do another toolpath or anything like that. It is ready to go right out of the software. And the Ready to Raster software is free to download once you've created your NextWave portal account at our website. Whether you have a account now or want to create it, it'll be there and available for when you want to.
Hey, Scott, I saw a question out there also that gentleman is asking, what height can you run the laser at as far as it still get results? Sounds like he's running it on a bowl or inside or outside of a bowl.
Yes, that was another good point for that. So with the 2 and 7 watt lasers, the collars on them, the white collars, are designed in such a way that whichever laser you have, the focal point for the laser is set to 1/10 of an inch above the material. So moving that white collar 0.1 or 1/10 of an inch above the surface of the material and zeroing the z-axis at that location puts the laser at its peak focal point. That being said, raising or lowering the height, and this is something that you can play around with as well to achieve different effects, but raising and lowering the height of the laser will take it in and out of focus a little bit. And when it's out of focus, it expands in kind of the shape of a football or kind of like a rectangle, if anything. With that, you can achieve wider lines. It may take a little bit slower of a feed rate because it's slightly out of focus, but you can still achieve burn with that out of focus or out of that focal height. One thing that can also be done, and this is more for the 7-watt laser. With the 7-watt laser, you can remove the white collar. Obviously, if you do this, try to keep in mind or try to protect anybody that might be walking into the shop from having direct exposure to looking at the light itself. But if you do remove the collar, the focal point from the bronze knurled ring at the tip of it is 0.8. One of the things that will help you with that, especially when it kind of comes to a bowl or something with a little bit of curvature to it, is you get a lot of that collar that takes up quite a bit of space out of the way. So you're able to get to the sides of the bowls where the wide body of it might have actually just been impacting or hindering you getting to those locations. It will still make a burn out of focus. It's just going to be a wide burn at that. So it's one thing to keep in mind. It's also something that if you've ever looked up laser engraving on the internet, is kind of a trick that a lot of people use to make wider lines as well for it. Let's see. One of the other questions that ended up coming in as well with that is, are we going to release something for the laser and the 4th axis rotary accessory? It's currently being developed, and we've made some progress on it. It's going to be mostly limited to the HD machines, so HD 4 series, HD 500 series, mainly because that it would actually have not only the necessary expansion port on the main control box for the 4th axis, but it also has the clearance height on it to be able to house or to mount up the laser accessory into the chuck and still have room for the 4th axis underneath it. It will be able to be achieved with both the mini 4th axis as well as the full size. The mini 4th axis would potentially need to purchase the additional driver card to be installed in the expansion port of the larger HD control box, but it's definitely something that can be achieved, and it's something that we're looking at right now. So hopefully that answers some of the questions about the laser accessory itself. I'd highly encourage you to take a look at the laser grid pattern link in the chat real quick. That'll be a kind of a good idea or a good starting spot for getting an idea of where your feeds and speed rates will be for getting started with it. But if you do ultimately have any questions, feel free to contact us at nextwavecnc.com. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. And one of the things that we're going to be trying to focus on this year as well is also building out that help center with additional articles and more information so that everyone can go to it at their leisure and get whatever answers they might be needing.
Got anything else, Scott?
That should be it for the lasers right now. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to hit us up on support. We're happy to help and getting you up and running or answer any questions you might have.
All right, Brendan and Mitchell, you guys have a couple questions?
I do have some questions that were sent to me. The first of which was a couple questions about the Ready to Control software. There's some pretty basic questions, but it's things like, can I use my Ready to Control software on my HD4? And our blanket answer for this is that yes, you can use Ready to Control on any software or on any machine that has a controller that supports our new pendant on it. So to put a more general statement on that, pretty much the HD4 and beyond, or any earlier machine that you've purchased a new control box for, will be able to use Ready to Control. Ready to control. The second question related to that is what's really the advantages versus disadvantages of using that versus the pendant to control your machine. And they're really, it's kind of just personal preference, but they each have a few things going for them. The ready to control software, obviously the biggest disadvantage is the fact that you have to have a computer physically near your machine the whole time it's running. For some people, that's fine if you just have a laptop. But for other people who have desktops that are farther away from their shops, the pendant is a nicer option. But the big draw to ready to control is the fact that it does have Virtual Zero Unlimited, which is a more powerful version of the Virtual Zero package that's included on every pendant. So ready to control, pendant, they're both pretty similar, but you do get a few cooler things in ready to control, like Virtual Zero Unlimited and more advanced G-code viewing. And those are all the questions that I saw coming my way, is really just pendant versus Virtual Zero Unlimited. I know that's kind of short, but I'm happy to answer any other questions as they come up.
Randy, could you mention a couple of the high points of the new firmware update to the pendant, some of the features that it added or reorganized?
Absolutely. So we recently did a fairly major update to the pendant and controller firmware, the biggest advantage of which is that now programming for your digital spindle is able to be done through the digital spindle interface cable that gets plugged in through the front. So there's no more worries about accidentally messing with the settings on your VFD or anything. You can just plug the cable into your control box and the control box will just do all the rest of it. So your actual spindle speed rate can be set through the G-code file, and you can just let the controller take off from there. We also got some user feedback that indicated that it really wasn't so useful to have a button on the main screen of the pendant that zeroed X, Y, and Z all at the same time. So we went ahead and split out that functionality to include a 0X and Y button, as well as a separate 0Z button. It's just small changes like that that kind of streamline the user experience so that you can zero your Z separately. And we have a few other updates, but I'm kind of restricted on talking about the contents of those until they're a little more locked down. But we do have a semi-large update coming for the firmware within the next week or so. So be on the lookout for that. I hope that does it justice, but if there's anything specific you'd like to know about, please let me know.
So I'm going to go through, at this point, a lot of the questions that came in today dealt with VCarve. So I'm going to spend a little time actually doing a live demo in VCarve on several subjects. These are some of the questions that came in, and I'm sure there's more. VCarve is a big topic, as most of you know, and that's why, I do a class. It's 4 2-hour evenings, and that sometimes hardly scratches this topic on a lot of it. But I'm going to touch base on a few things and a few specific questions that came in as we look forward here. One is, some people are asking about 3D modeling and setup. And 3D modeling and 3D carving is a big topic, but I'm going to give you a quick tour of the basic, we call it a workflow, the basic steps you go through in VCarve. And so one of them is, where do you get your 3D models to carve? Well, one of the easiest sources is right inside VCarve. Inside the clip art tab, you should have a tab called clip art. And this refers to 3D clip art. And when you open that list up, you'll see different groups of clip art, 3D clip art. Now, if you don't see anything, what you need to do is go out to your Vectric account webpage and go under your software downloads. And there's a place, and there's several files that you have to download for each one of these. And once you download those and you double click on them or open them your computer, it will automatically install it into your software, and then they will appear automatically in your software. But when you first upload VCarve, it may not include some of these files. And the way you know that is you'll see an arrow bind or something that suggests you need to download it, or it'll be grayed out. But there's a whole selection of great 3D art that comes with it. The other location, if you go out to your main, when you sign into your VCarve page, if you scroll to the bottom, there's actually a link down here called Design and Make. And Design and Make is a co-business with Vetric, a partner business. And if you go out there, they have a lot of great 3D art. Some free, but mostly for sale, different topics, different themes. It's a great place. And one thing, I get this question often, are there other sources for 3D art? This one I can 100% recommend as far as the fact that these models are designed to carve on your CNC. You're going to find a couple of types of models out there, typically something called an STL file, and they're readily available on the internet. GrabCAD, AutoCAD, different programs create them, and different websites carry them. However, some of that 3D models that are out there are actually 360 degrees, like a full shape of a person's head. And while you can make use of some of that, you have to go through a couple more setups to make that work. Really what you're looking for is 3D relief art like this dinosaur, which is probably no more than a ½ inch thick. The other thing you're going to find with some of the clip art or the 3D art you find out in the general internet is that some of it is really made for gaming, or it's made for web illustrations, and the resolution is really low. And so when you bring it into VCarve, you end up with something that looks very faceted with lots of flat angles on it. And that's because it's really created just for the internet or for gaming, so it has a very low resolution. And then some of the 3D art actually has what are referred to as undercuts. Obviously the CNC cannot reach behind this dinosaur's chin to carve the undercut, the space that's actually under there. And so you'll just won't be able to carve that. So those are some of the things to look for. But if you do go to Design and Make, you'll certainly have a good selection starting there. So back in the software, let's bring that project up again here. So basic setup, or for basic 3D design, I've pre-designed a project in here. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Let's see if I've got it. So it's made up of these 3 fish and some carving, and we'll take a look at what that looks like in the main window. So this is what it looks like when it's all put together. Now to reach this point, I'm working in the layers over here. If you've not used layers before, it takes a little bit of practice, but it's a great way to organize your information. So starting out with the blank sheet, I'm going to go to clip art, and all I have to do is double click on the item that I want to use, and it puts it right into the area. Then I can move that around, stretch it out, center it, lots of ways to center it, lots of ways to size it. And then I can also add some other items. In this case, I want to bring that other fish in. So I'm going to bring that one in. And I have that. I'm going to go back to drawing up here, the drawing tab. I'm going to take that item, drag it down here, and then I'm going to resize it. Let's make it about 2 inches tall. See if that works out. A little bit small. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And then I could also copy it and paste it. And there's probably 2 on top. Let's drag it over. There we go. And here's a little shortcut key. If I click on the H button on my keyboard, it'll flip that in the horizontal position, just like that. So maybe I want both of those facing in. So I click on this one, and I can put those either direction. Of course, then I could go in and I could use my text tool to add some text accordingly. Once I have that all laid out, and let me flip over to the one that's complete here. So I've laid out some text. I have some text that's actually on the carving as well as some text that's down below here. At this point, I'm ready to go over to my toolpath side and start setting up some toolpaths. Again, if you're fairly new to CNC or VCarve, you'll learn that these are the different toolpaths. And for 3D carving, there are basically two types of toolpaths you're going to be using. It's going to be this roughing, what's called the roughing, and the finishing. And it does exactly what it says. The roughing takes the majority of the material away, and then the finishing takes the next one away. So if I wanted to set up for this carving, things organized here a little bit. When I pop open the roughing toolpath, the first thing you have to do is select your bits. And I'm going to talk about bits here in a little bit. But right now I have a 1/4 inch end mill selected, and an end mill bit is a good bit for roughing out the carving. In this case, you have several options here of what area that you want to carve. I'm going to carve the model boundary. So it's going to carve just on top of each of those 3 models. And then there's some other settings here, which I'm just going to accept the defaults for now and click calculate. And here you can see how it now is just going to carve. And if I preview that, you'll see how it roughs out. And it's using just an end mill bit to rough it out, taking it in several passes. And it's going to leave a blanket of material on top of the actual model, which we'll then carve out with the finishing toolpath. So I have a double one in here, which means I added it twice. So I need to go into my model. What I'm pointing out here is the fact that I've got double images because when I added those extra fish, it doubled up with the design I already had there. One thing you'll come to learn, or if you haven't noticed, this preview, as well as what's called the carving preview, is very accurate. And if you don't see what you don't like in this picture or one of those preview windows, you should stop for a minute and say, what's going on? Because if you go to your machine, it's going to end up looking, what you see here is pretty much what you get at your machine or possibly even worse. So for right now, I just need to go back to my modeling setup and let me get that up over here. And I will see that I have doubles. So I'm going to take and turn off a couple of visibility on some of those. And now when I go back in and I'm going to bring down the tool paths that I've already created right here. Reset that. And once again, there's the finishing tool path, or rather the roughing tool path that you set up first. And next, when I preview the finishing tool path, you'll notice how it just cuts right down to the surface because it's just taking a slight layer off that was left by the roughing tool path. The finishing tool path knows where the model is, and it's just cutting right down to the model. So if you don't have a model in your design, it's not going to do any carving. That's why those two tool paths are very specifically designed to work with 3D models in VCarve. Now, the next thing I've got designed here is I've got some text on this. Now, something that's worth noticing, if I turn this up on the side here, turn down a little bit, you notice how the text of the flat area is laying on the top, but this area is laying down inside that 3D model. There's a great setting inside the VCarve toolpath down near the bottom that says project toolpath on the 3D model. And when you click that, if your V-carving is over a 3D model. It actually wraps it down over that curve, that shape, which is exactly what it's done here. So when I go to carve it, you'll notice in the flat area, it'll carve in the flat area, but in the curve on the shape, it'll carve inside the shape. So that's a really handy setup to do some creative work that way. The last item I have here is I've used what's called the chamfering toolpath to create a chamfer or a bevel around the edge. And that gives a little bit of a bevel on the finished project. People ask sometimes, well, how do you hold that down to your project if you're going to carve around the edge? One technique, there's a couple of them. The one that I use is I will sometimes do a little hot melt glue along the edge, and then it carves off very easily later. Or another one is you put masking tape, like blue tape, painter's tape on the back of the project, as well as on your table. And then use a little CA or super glue to hold the board in place. And then when you're done carving, you pry it off with a screwdriver, pry bar, chisel, something like that. It's another way to use no clamps. It all depends on what you're how you're trying to hold it down or what it's for. But now that I have these 4 tool paths, I want to go back inside this icon right here, go back inside the tool database and talk about the tools a little bit. Within this tool database, you have a library of tools, and the question often comes up, what kind of tools should I set up and what are the different tools? And I want to look at kind of something here I'll bring up. Back to the 2D window. These are layers. I can hide everything and I can bring up. So this is what I wanted to show you. Within the tool database, I bring that open again. You'll see a tool drop-down menu, and these are the default types of tools that Vectric has made available for default settings. Each one of these have different kinds of settings that go with them. So if you pick a V-bit, you have to set up the angle. If you select a tapered ball nose, there's an angle and a radius you have to pick up, set up, several things like that. But from that list, these are the major types. And everything but the last one here, Vectric has settings already set up that you could just choose your diameter, the number of flutes, the angle on the V-bit, the radius on the bullnose, the taper on the tapered bit. If you've got an engraving bit, it'll even allow you to the little flat end on it. And a radius end mill is like a bowl bit. You put in the radius and the diameter of the bit, how many flutes it has, and those are all predefined already in the list up here. If you have a custom bit, such as what's called a form cutting bit, an OG bit, an ovalo bit, something like what you see here, for this bit, then you end up drawing that in VCarve and you save out the profile of that, and that imports into the database, and you have a custom form cutting bit. So these are all the different bits that are readily available, and basically what differs are the angles, the diameters, and the radius. You end up with a whole variety of those. But again, if you're just starting out, a couple of straight bits and a couple of V bits and a couple of ball nose bits, that'll get you started. These 4 bits right through here, you end up with maybe a half a dozen or maybe a dozen bits at the most of different sizes. And that'll you do a lot of work just with those. Okay, the last thing there's 2 more things I want to look at in here. One is if we save these bits out, or these tool paths, you click on the save icon right here to save out your tool paths to a TAP file. And then your TAP file, you're either going to take to your pendant via the thumb drive, or you're going to save it to your computer when you hook your computer up when you're running Ready to Control. But if we look at I have these 4 tool paths down here, and people ask often, well, what are the different ways of saving it? The simplest way is this first checkbox at the top. It says selected toolpath. So whatever toolpath down here is selected or highlighted, so notice if I click on roughing, then roughing shows up here in the middle. If I click on finishing, finishing. So this is a one-off, whatever one is selected, that's what you can save. The second one refers to visible toolpaths, and visible toolpaths have to do with whether the checkbox is checked. So notice when I check the checkbox, it becomes visible and the toolpath appears at the top. So I can check multiple boxes and make all those visible. However, because I have 3 different kinds of bits I'm using, it's giving me an error and it's telling me that I have visible toolpaths use different tools. So that won't work. However, my VBit, I have 2 toolpaths for that. And because it uses the same bit, I can save those out together and I could run those together and save myself having to stop and start the machine again. So when you have bits of this same identical geometry, it's the same bit, you can save those toolpaths out even though they're different types of toolpaths, a chamfer and a V-carving one. So it's a great way to save a little time at the machine and have fewer toolpaths on your pendant. Now, the third choice up here is really rather interesting. If I click that, I can select all my toolpaths, and I've clicked on group where possible. Grouping where possible means that these bottom 2 VBit toolpaths, these 2 are going to be grouped together when I save it, and the others are going to come out separately. When I click on save, it's going to give me an option to give me a file name or a kind of a master name for this group of toolpaths. So I'm just going to call this fish carving. And when I click on save, take a little bit there. Okay, now I could actually just hit save again, and we'll jump back into that same folder. And notice what it did. It put the name I put in front of it, and then it automatically numbered them in the order that they appeared in my list. So number 1 is the roughing, number 2 is the finishing, and number 3 and 4 is the V-carving. Now it picked the name from my V-carving top, but it is both the 3rd and 4th toolpath. And that combined those because it uses the same bit. So it's another strategy you could use for naming bits. I find this really handy because from an organizational standpoint, it allows you to give it a name and save it. You'll notice that if I back up in my file format here, I've got several 3D carving files in here. Here's my fish award, and there are my 3 files, tap files that I'm going to use if I use the ready to control. Otherwise, I can also save those out to my pendant or the thumb drive for my pendant. One other question that comes up in here is post-processors. Now, if you've set up your tool according to how Vectric recommends it, and you've looked for your machine, you'll have your current NextWave CNC post-processor. However, the question came up on laser post-processors before. If we go back to the website again, and I'd showed you earlier about the downloads link, and then going down to the laser module, and then post-processor help center. And again, you see Scott Latham's name popping up here because he's the one that's done a lot of work on this with all this extra information at the help center. So it's a great resource. I'm just, even just promoting the help center in general. There's a lot of information out here. But if we go scroll down this post-processor page, you're going to find the list of current and active post-processors based on the machine you have. And here's the laser post-processor right here. When you click on that, it's then going to give you the opportunity to save it. And depending on how your computer is set up, if I look up here, this is where mine shows it. I can see it. I can even go and look at it. And it shows up in my downloads folder. However, I've already prepped it a little bit. So I'm going to show you. I've moved that from my downloads folder, I moved it over to one other folder that I can access it from. So while I'm inside this software, I can go open a machine and go down to post-processor management. Underneath there, I have a whole list of default post-processors, but I want my custom one that's on my computer or my one that I downloaded from the website. So I click on this folder, that brings up my computer window, and I have it right here, NextWave Laser Post Processor. So when I click on that and click open, it says, would you like to make this post your default post processor? I'm going to say okay for right now. And let's close out of this, and then let's see if it pops up. So there's the laser right there, okay? So I can click OK, and then the laser shows up here as my default for if I want to do laser work. Now, I still have my other one down here, so I can easily select that. And so you can switch back and forth between the two of them. So that's how you would add the post processor if you're doing the laser work or other posts for the rotary. It's the same way. There's rotaries available as well. You can download in the same fashion. So that pretty much wraps it up on this part of it. Any questions or comments from the team?
Randy, one thing that I wanted to point out with that adding the post processor and the manage that you went through, that method is only through Vectrix vCarve or the 11 version. Previous versions, it's handled a little bit differently in their post processor or their application data folder and the my post P folder as well, how we pointed out.
I'll show people that because it's an excellent point. Scott was mentioning the application data folder, and that's where you access it. So if you don't have version 11, then that file that downloaded from the help center, you would place it inside this folder. Correct, Scott?
Correct.
Yep.
It's basically like one less step. It's not the associating it with a machine. Anything
Right.
you put in my post P will become your default list of post processors to select from.
In the version 11 or 10 rather, correct?
Yes.
Excellent point.
One other thing to point out for the NextWave Laser inch or millimeter, it is compatible with both, as I mentioned earlier, the quick engrave method for firing the laser, or if you purchased Vectrix laser module add-on, it's compatible with using that method also. So it's one post processor for the lasers for both method.
Very good. Okay, so Scott, let's see. You had a couple more questions on your list here. I'll pass the mic back to you.
All right. So taking a look at kind of going down the list of topics and stuff that I had, there were a couple of them that came through about maintenance for the machines themselves. Some of it just being what maintenance should I do, as well as how to do it itself. So all of the CNC machines, past, present, all of them, future, still can be cleaned with your DuPont, for example, Teflon silicone spray, wiping down guide rods, rails, all of it. So for the SD series or the Piranha FX or XL, as they were previously named, the HD4 series and even before, all of those use the guide rails and bearing system. The entire maintenance can be done for all of it, guide rails, threaded rods, everything, with just your Teflon, your silicone Teflon spray, the dry lubricant. The HD5 series, the X and Z motor bearings along those rails do require some to be lubricated with an EP1 lithium grease. That can be on the Z-axis is really the best place to kind of show where those are at, or at least see when you take a look at your machine. At the top, there's a little silver, basically looks like a nipple on the bearing itself, in line with the Z-axis guide rails. It has a small bearing on the top of it, using our greasing kit on there, and either a flex hose with a larger greasing gun, or even just a mini grease gun you could pick up at Harbor Freight, Home Depot as well. and using that EP1 lithium grease, those require at least about every 40 hours or so for Z and X. As Randy has up here, not only just the video that we put together, but also kind of some additional instructions and pictures if needed for those. I picked up a local or a mini grease gun from Home Depot, just happened to see it, figured I would get it for my machine. Those do require at least, every 40 hours, at least for those bearings. The more you clean it, the better it's going to be for you. The more it's going to be an all-around better experience for it as well. Another question that we had received in there as well was how to take care of the Y-axis guide rails on the HD5 series. With the side skirts on there, there's kind of two ideas of thoughts on that. One is just spraying the Teflon silicone from the slat or through the slats onto the guide rails themselves, and running the bearings using the Y-axis, run it along those to not only lubricate the guide rods, but also get that in through the bearings as well. To get in there and really clean them, it would require the, removing or disconnecting and sliding out of the way the side skirts to really get under there. Every now and then, depending on use, it is good, maybe once a month, maybe less, something like that. Once again, depending on use. Cleaning every bit of it, once again, guide rails, guide rods, threaded rods, all of it with a mineral spirit or another mild solvent to remove any, wood glue, resin, things that might just build up over time that the Teflon silicone doesn't just wipe away for it. Vacuuming after each use is a great thing to not only start but end the day as well with the machine. For my Shark 2 at home, I tend to keep just a paintbrush on hand, as that helps brush a lot of the debris and stuff out from like behind the back of the router, along some of the harder places it is to get a shop vac or something into those locations. So that's one other thing that you could possibly keep in mind with it as well. 6-inch piece of a 6-inch piece of fine, whatever you have laying around, and another screw, and rotating that around so you can see where your high spots and low spots are. Generally, if you need to do this, what you would end up seeing is if you're planing off your spoil board with a larger planing bit, as it would emphasize it quite a bit more, as you start seeing ridges and things like that, or scaling. Those would indicate that you need to square that up a little bit. The HD5 series quick tramming is going to be handled at the router clamp itself, either adding aluminum or steel shims to the back of the clamp, either at the top or the bottom, will correct if it's pitching forward or back. Left or right movement, there is some play in just the mounting bolts themselves. So loosening those 3 of them up and pivoting them a little bit will help with that. If that's not successful, loosening the machine screws that go directly into the bolts in the bearing block behind it would allow you to adjust for left and right, or like counterclockwise and counterclockwise rotation. We're working on making that an article in our help center, but if you have any questions on that, reach out to us in support. We do have a couple documentation real quick that we'd be able to shoot your way and get you taken care of. Another question that was received is, what's the rapid rate and the feed rate for they specifically asked for the HD520. This can go along with all of our new HD machines, so the HD5 series, as well as it'll be functioning on the 4 and our SD series as well. The rapid travel, so traveling above your material, going from one place to the next, your starting position, back to your starting position, that's going to be a rapid travel of 200 inches per minute. That's what it caps out at. The feed rate, and Randy goes over a lot of this in some of the classes that he gives about VCarve. can vary quite a bit, mostly based, a lot of it based on multiple different variables, anything from material, the bit being used, RPMs, pass depth, step over, chip load, all that good stuff. Generally for the HD5 series though, you're operating anywhere between 80 to 120 inches per minute, somewhere in there. One helpful tip that we give over in the tech room is start your project at the settings that you want to, pass depth and step over, things like that, no more than 50% the diameter of the bit, but start the feed rate at 100 inches per minute. And whichever RPMs you're looking for as well, if you have the digital interface cable to transmit that over to the spindle. When you go to run the file, and you have this option in both the LC dependent as well as ready to control, start the file itself at 50% of the feed rate using the feed rate slider bars. And as the file's cutting, increase it by 10% at a time. Once it happens to start skipping or you start seeing the cuts being more ragged, drop it down by 5%. So that way you can kind of find the happy medium of this bit, this material, these settings work at this speed. So that would be kind of a good starting spot to at least recommend or have customers start with. I'm sure Randy can elaborate more on that, but that would be at least a good way. And starting at 100 inches per minute, for me, starting at 50% is easy math. Moving it different, you're 1 for 1 for your inches per minute.
That's a good suggestion, Scott. The 100 inches per minute starting point is a conservative location to start at. I was really surprised when I upgraded my HD4 to an HD5, how much more aggressive I was able to be. And I routinely now run my HD5 at as high as 150 to 160 inches a minute. Now, it doesn't always achieve that because just like when you drive your car, when you come to a corner, you have to slow down. So if you're doing small work, it's probably not going to reach maximum speed anyway. But when I'm surfacing the top of the machine, the top of the deck, or doing a large project, I'll set it up at those faster speeds. Where I do go conservative is on my depth of pass depth. I rarely, no matter what bit I'm using, I rarely go much more than 1/10 of an inch, occasionally 1/8 of an inch. And I have cut deeper than that, but I would rather maintain my cutting speed than go deeper. And on the step over for a straight bit, maybe about 40%, like Scott said, 50%. 40% is kind of a standard too. For ball nose and V carves, you're even going to go less than that because of the type of carving they do. But, and on spindle speed, I find myself running between 18 and 22,000 most of the time. There's a whole theory behind that with chip load and that. It's a whole large discussion, but I would just suggest that if you have an HD5 somewhere between, around 100, 120, those are just good conservative numbers. You might push it a little bit higher. You probably don't need to go much slower than that. Just don't take too deep a pass or too much of a step over. If you do it with the HD4 or the Piranha SD series, you're probably going to be under 100 for most of your cutting. What you want to avoid, I talked to a guy this week, he had an HD5 and he was cutting maple and he was just burning the heck out of it. And that's because he had set the speed at only like 30 inches a minute. And he was just going so slow and he was burning his wood. So I told him to triple his speed and he got a lot better result with that then. So some of it's a lot of trial and error. And that's why we encourage people to get out there, do some test runs, try some different feeds and speeds. We got more information, available on the website. There's the classes you could attend as well, where we go to a lot of that stuff in a lot of detail. But those are some guidelines to get you started as well. Well, we're pretty much out of time tonight. Let me just check the Q&A for one more thing. What we will do, though, is we're still going to send an email out with some resources. And you are free to respond to that email with any questions you don't feel you got adequately answered tonight. And if we're able to respond to those through tech support or through a tip or a resource or a document, we will do that. If it's a bigger topic, like how do I set up my spoil board, I'm going to point you towards the class or the laser. If you want to learn more about that, we've got a class for that coming up too. So other than that, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I'm glad everybody came out. It was a good group. And I want to thank Scott and Mitchell and Brendan for being here tonight. I appreciate their support as well. So everybody have a good night and a good weekend coming up. Take care.